Vannevar Bush lived from 1890 to 1974, living just behind the curtain of the world stage for a large portion of his professional career. Bush had the opportunity to rub elbows with the likes of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, Winston Churchill, and Leslie Groves. Despite this association with powerful people, Vannevar Bush is not a name that rings as familiar. The question, who is Vannevar Bush, is an enticing one only because the answer is not so easily obtained. Bush's name might have been left to the wayside if it not for his connection to the infamous mushroom cloud that burst onto the scene in 1945. The atomic bomb required not only immense technical skill to build, but bureaucratic mastery to bind all the required pieces together. Vannevar Bush was the man whose hands wove those things into one tapestry. Bush's name pops up next to FDR, Churchill, and Groves because he was in the room where it happened. Without Vannevar Bush, there might not have been an atomic bomb. However, no character in the story of that dreaded device could be so linked to it while standing so far away from it. Bush's contributions were in the construction of organization and persuasion, not in physics. In many ways, Bush is like the doctor who delivers a baby. Without him, the bomb might not exist. However, he is not there to make it, and he has no say in whether or not the birth happens. Bush's job is merely to make sure it can happen should everyone else involved decide to pull the trigger. When trying to track Bush's life back through time, there were what seemed limitless roadblocks. These obstacles might have humored the man who himself was proud of the fact that he, quote, kept his records in such a way as to give any potential biographer a pretty rough time, end quote. Despite all of this, Vannevar Bush liked to write. His memoir, Pieces of the Action, shed light into the things which he thought important to remember. At other points in Bush's life, he was tasked with writing. One such famous occasion was by President FDR, which resulted in a famous report titled The Endless Frontier. A final interesting piece of writing by Bush was an article published in The Atlantic called The American Scholar. While these writings will be looked at in more detail later, they do explain an interesting detail about Vannevar Bush. The man liked to write, just not about himself. Bush remarked in Pieces of the Action that the presence of personal ambition is distasteful to him. Because of all of this, the porthole into Bush's life is small. However, there is still room to peer in and get to know Vannevar Bush. There are well-documented signposts of his life, even if the details are more scarce. It is a story that begins and ends in Massachusetts. Vannevar Bush was born on March 11, 1890, and was described by the New York Times in 1976, just 2 days after his death, as a, quote, frail youngster, end quote. Whatever the case, such a disposition did not keep Bush down as he attended high school in Chelsea, Mass., which the New York Times referred to casually as a rough Boston suburb. There is little defined with regard to Bush's upbringing or time in high school. Chelsea High School only has yearbooks going back as far as 1925, and so no embarrassing school photos can easily be found. People seem to leave Bush's mother out of the question. In his short biographical memoir about Vannevar Bush, Jerome B. Wisner does not mention a mother at all, and the New York Times only goes as far as to give her name Emma Linwood Payne Bush. What seems to be important to everyone, however, is that Vannevar Bush's father was a hard-working minister who, quote, started his career as a cook on a mackerel smack at Provincetown, Massachusetts at the age of 14, end quote. The various websites, biographers, and obituaries that took the time to acknowledge Vannevar Bush brushed past his early years. They all seem to jump straight to the meat of the situation when Bush graduated college and began his career. The institution of Tufts College has a few things to say themselves about Vannevar Bush. Multiple family members graduated the institution, including Bush's father and 2 sisters. They make sure to mention Bush's father too, adding in that Richard Perry Bush lectured at the Tufts School of Religion. Bush would return to Tufts after graduating with a doctorate degree from a joint program helmed by Harvard and MIT as an assistant professor until 1919. Bush's time at MIT is just as nebulous, though he did return to the institution to work as a professor of electronics power transmission, where he did additional work on submarine detection for the U.S. Navy during World War I. His work during this time is the thing that sets Vannevar Bush apart. He works on the right projects at the right time and continues to make connections with the right people. Bush recalls these moments in pieces of the action in an interesting fashion. They are memories that come across as facts. Bush seems uninterested in how he made those accomplishments, writing, quote, "I had served for 6 years as vice president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology." Elsewhere he writes, "I have worked in organizations of many sorts, academic, government, business," end quote. Vannevar Bush seems more interested in telling people about inventions he understands than feats he accomplished. His written works are full of asides where he spends paragraphs describing an invention simply because it came up in his train of thought. He does this on page 29 and 30 of Pieces of the Action. Entire sections of his article, The Atlantic, do the same, while entire sections of The Endless Frontier are dedicated to similar tasks. Vannevar Bush is excited about inventions and clinical about everything else. All of that to say, Vannevar Bush was good enough at what he did to be chosen to lead committees, become the vice president of MIT, and become friends with people in positions of power and influence within America. Regardless of how Bush felt about himself, his time at these institutions and the connections he made there catapulted him right into the middle of the race to build an atomic bomb. Bush recalls being president of the Carnegie Institute for Technology, but only shares a story of when he left. The place which allowed him such connection and opportunity to the larger world is retold by the memory that he would not allow his, quote, portrait to be added to the gallery of former presidents, for I was gun-shy of formal portraits, end quote. Another thing to note on this matter that Bush does recall is that it was at the Carnegie Institute in Washington that the, quote, whole concept of fission promptly came to a head, end quote. This further solidifies the idea that his role as president allowed Bush the opportunity to stick his nose in the business of the atomic bomb. Without it, Bush may not have known the proper people or had a high enough profile to be noticed by FDR. Bush was noticed by FDR, however, and was appointed to be the National Defense Research Committee, NDRC. The goal of the committee was to, quote, coordinate, supervise, and conduct scientific research on the problem underlying the development, production, and use of mechanisms and devices of warfare, end quote. A goal Bush himself referred to merely as a, quote, civilian organization of scientists and engineers for the purpose of developing new weapons for military use, end quote. This appointment put Bush not just on FDR's doorstep, but inside the room with him. The NDRC quickly turned into the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, which included medicine in its research, had its own funds, and reported directly to the President of the United States. It is during this time that Bush came abreast to the atomic bomb. It was at this time that all of his connections came together. Quote, we were all drawn together in early 1940 by one thing we deeply shared, worry, end quote. Vannevar Bush describes the time before Pearl Harbor in words that show a time which can be difficult to imagine. It perhaps shows an idealism that exists more in imagination than real life. For Bush, however, the outlook is real. Some of the smartest people in the world are concerned about the future and decided to come together and see what could be done. Bush and his companions had powerful connections and knew the right people. Not everyone gets called together because the President of the United States wants to hear what you have to say. Bush takes time to explain what the individuals on the committees were thinking and the circumstances in the world which caused them to act. In some ways, this causes Bush to muddle the story. He often writes things in such a way that you can watch his mind drift about before finally coming back around. Stanley Goldberg, writing about Bush's role in the decision to build the atomic bomb, puts it succinctly by saying, quote, he, Bush, condensed the description of the plan to a one-page memo that was then introduced to Roosevelt by Hopkins on the 27th of June, 1940. Roosevelt approved it on the spot. Bush was appointed to lead a committee that was his idea. It takes Bush a long time to reveal this particular detail. The way Bush tells the story puts the creation of the NDRC on his shoulders and that of his friends. They wanted to help fight the war in their own unique way, and were lucky that Bush was charismatic enough to convince FDR to say yes. The meeting with FDR seems to be a forever mystery. Even Bush, when recalling the story, does not give the specific details of what was said, or why the president was so ready to agree. Bush does note that FDR's advisor, Henry Hopkins, might have helped pave the way. Regardless, the meeting according to Bush's recollection, took less than 10 minutes and only involved 4 short paragraphs. With this presidential approval, Vannevar Bush and his collection of worried citizens became the, quote, presidential appointees, and transformed from a group of concerned citizens to a powerful committee. When the NDRC transformed into the OSRD in the other months of 1941, Bush found himself in the possession of even more authority. Goldberg writes that, quote, Bush now had the authority to control every stage of development of new weapons from inception to final stages of manufacture. The New York Times now dubbed Bush the Czar of Research. Bush himself recalls that he was outside the control of government organizations focused on budgets, remarking that they were, quote, disturbed and, quote, occasionally tried to do something about it, end quote. Bush's work on committee was administrative. He spent the day procuring money, making contracts with universities, and dodging budget sharks, all while staying behind the scenes. Bush makes it clear in Pieces of the Action that his involvement with the whole project was not technical writing, saying, quote, not a single technical idea of mine ever amounted to shucks, end quote. For Vannevar Bush, World War II was a busy and nonviolent affair. He conducted ideas, some of which were not his own, and worked to tie the government's need directly to the places that could most easily and efficiently fulfill them. Being a university man, he tended to pick universities. Quote, we decided that we could make contracts for research directly with universities, end quote. Bush writes so that the government would not leave a, quote, university holding the bag on all the extra costs involved, end quote. Often the scientists or equipment needed resided at universities, and Bush knew that if their expertise was to be procured, then money would have to be spent. So, what of the atomic bomb? Vannevar Bush's life is made consequential because of his proximity to that dreaded device. Bush creates the infrastructure that builds the bomb, procures the funding, and enables the device to be cultivated and made real. Additionally, Bush was on the interim committee that advised then President Harry Truman to drop the bomb. Evidence does not suggest that Bush bears the weight for this decision. He was surrounded by people who also wanted to drop the bombs for one reason or another. Bush was not the only man in the room on this occasion. Bush's personal feelings about the bomb, however, are dynamite when considering the use of that dreaded device. Analyzing his personal feelings and motives for dropping the bomb reveal a somewhat clinical and reserved view of things. 2 opinions stood out the brightest in Pieces of the Action that stand to clarify Bush's feelings about the bomb. The first was that he, quote, knew that Japan would succumb within a matter of months, even if the bomb were not used. This demonstrates a belief that the bomb was not necessary, though his work on the interim committee tells us that he did believe the use of the bomb was worthwhile somehow. Bush's opinion of American victory may not have been shared by everyone in higher levels of American government, but such optimism seems to be consistent throughout Bush's writings. Bush puts his second opinion about the bomb in the following way, saying, quote, I also felt sure that the use of the bomb far less terrible in my mind than the fire raids of Tokyo, end quote. Having this particular belief squares away Bush's opinion on the interim committee. Bush was present at the Trinity test site and witnessed the first atomic explosion. Even still, the non-nuclear firebombs that were already raining down upon Tokyo seemed more deadly to Vannevar Bush. This opinion of Bush's is difficult to wrestle with. There is little in his upbringing or previous comments that would explain why an atomic explosion did not seem worse to him than a firebomb. Perhaps his view is the correct one. What does shine through is a certain level of clinical thought that persists throughout all of Bush's writings. It is this clinical air that makes his memoir so interesting. Bush writes from a pedestal with which he uses to look down upon the world. From that height, he could coldly remark about what he sees. This means that no matter how accurate Bush's predictions might be, they do not always appear to carry human hope. There are places where Bush tries to showcase a hope that the reader must assume he genuinely believes. That hope does not appear in his writings about the atomic bomb. Quote, I knew that civilization faced an utterly new era, and I felt that it might as well face it squarely, end quote. Bush wrote those words when describing the potential for biological warfare to be as, quote, terrible as an atomic weapon. It is one of his many technological asides. This realization caused Bush to look at the world in a binary way. It clarified for him what comes across in Pieces of the Action as a sort of false dilemma. Humanity would either refrain formally or informally from the use of weapons of mass destruction, or it could thrust itself back into the Dark Ages. It is truly hard to say where such thinking crept into Bush's belief system. Perhaps it was all that time spent around university folk. Perhaps it was a lifetime surrounded by 2 world wars and the Great Depression. It is hard to say because Bush does not react or write about these things. He prefers to analyze and remember others and other things. His analysis of the bomb continues when he writes, quote, "If for no other reason, I would justify the use of the bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki because it was the only way to which the dilemma could be presented with adequate impact on world consciousness." So then to Vannevar Bush, the atomic bombs were an object lesson, the most basic and primitive teaching tool. This makes his decision to advise that the bombs be dropped difficult to objectively handle. On one hand, Bush was only one of many who came to such a conclusion. To put the weight of an entire decision on his shoulders seems unfair. On the other hand, Bush's reasons for wanting the bomb to be dropped are so clinical and personal that they do not fit well in a narrative driven by the desire to save lives or deter Russians. At the end of it all, perhaps what Vannevar Bush best deserves is a participation trophy. That was his goal, after all, to participate, a concerned citizen with the ear of a president and the ego of an accomplished man. Vannevar Bush got to be there. Most of what is known about Vannevar Bush comes after the war, when he finally sat down and committed his own thoughts to paper. At the time, his name is one that does not garner much recognition. His place on the interim committee is overshadowed by the existence of the committee itself. Bush's name appears alongside other titans of history and is therefore easily overlooked. In many ways, Bush seemed content to remain in the background forever. To close out his story, however, there are 2 short stories that seem of some importance. The first is quick. It is an aside in the pile of general information that does exist about Vannevar Bush. When studying Bush's post-war life, it becomes evident that he went back to what he knew, which was university life. Bush served as chairman and then honorary chairman of MIT until his passing and could often be found on campus. In Bush's own words, he, quote, proceeded to fold and go out of circulation, end quote. There are some interesting theories as to why. Bush himself says that the, quote, stress and frustrations finally caught up with him, and that by the time I recovered my balance, the whole relation between government and his scientists and engineers had taken new forms in new hands, end quote. A write-up for the Science History Institute sheds a little more light onto the situation, writing, Bush never developed a productive relationship with President Harry Truman and was less attuned to the new Cold War politics, end quote. Additionally, the Institute notes that Bush came out against the hydrogen bomb when it was first introduced. It seems eventually atomic weaponry took a step too far. The second story takes place at the end of World War II, but it seems to carry an irony that would best not be overlooked. In the article Bush wrote for The Atlantic, one quote stands out amongst all the rest. When discussing the sheer amount of knowledge a scientist has to know in order to stay current, Bush writes, quote, "The investigator is staggered by the findings and conclusions of thousands of other workers, conclusions which he cannot find time to grasp, much less remember as they appear," end quote. Bush continues the thought by describing Gregor Mendel's work on genetics. The laws of the genetics were, quote, lost to the world for a generation because his publication did not reach the few who were capable of grasping and extending it. Truly significant attainments became lost in the mass of the inconsequential, end quote. In many respects, the life of Vannevar Bush followed the path of Gregor Mendel's genetics, lost in the mass of inconsequential.